Welcome, Jenny. It's really great to have you back. This is take two. Our first attempt was a great conversation, but as we realised, perhaps not everybody else would have enjoyed it. So it's great to have an excuse to join you again this morning. We met several years ago through mutual friend Annie, and it's been a real pleasure to follow your work ever since. As really one of the people I look up to in Australia, researching the ethics of technology in a really pragmatic and practical way. So really looking forward to talking about your new book today. But before I go any further, would you like to introduce yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here again. I'm excited about this bonus take of our conversation. So I'm a sociologist at the Australian National University. I've been in Australia for about 4 years, and what I do here is generally research technology and society through multiple lenses. But what I've been researching in particular are ethics in tech startups and technological affordances, which is a concept that we will get into in greater depth. But that is the topic of the book I just wrote, essentially about the social dynamics of technological design.
Amazing. And we are going to get straight into the book, and I've got a quote here from your book. And the quote is that humans and technologies are co-constitutive, and human-technology relations are power-laden and political. Can you paint a picture of the current technological landscape and try to help explain to anyone who's listening, how is it that technology perpetuates power and politics?
Okay. So one thing that I think is important to point out is that power and politics have always been embodied in technologies. If you look back to really common technologies like the photography and photographic imagery, what we know is that photographs have traditionally captured light skin more easily than dark skin. If you look at the bridges in New York City, they're really low, which means that buses can't get under them, which means that there are entire parts of New York that are inaccessible to people who rely on public transit, which of course corresponds with social class, which intersects with race. And so what we see is that technologies have always been political and power laden. And we see that continue and amplify today. For example, skin sensors that can't detect dark skin, hiring algorithms that continuously, no matter how much we tweak them, preference white men, parole decision, automated systems that are punitive towards men of color in particular. And so what we see is a landscape in which our technologies that infuse the mundane practices of everyday life, as well as really consequential decisions and institutions, reflect and perpetuate and often amplify existing social hierarchies and stratifications.
The bus example you've given, your book was the second time that I'd come across that, and I think it's a really interesting example because it's unclear whether it was intentional or unintentional. But as I understand it, the bus routes that were interrupted by the bridges were the bus routes to get to the beaches, and the wealthy beaches, I should say. And so, is it true that to this date, that has continued to be a barrier to certain classes making their way to those parts of New York State?
Yeah, so there have been some infrastructural workarounds. So the original person who wrote about that was Langdon Winner in the 1970s. Right. And there's been some critique of that work since then that says, actually, when they weren't designed for that reason, at the end of the day, they were designed and had that effect. So we don't know about the intention of Robert Moses, who built those bridges, but they did have the effect of preventing essentially poor communities of color from accessing the Hamptons, which is a very swanky part of Long Island. There have been infrastructural workarounds, but again, they're retrofitted, which is actually a really common thing that you see is technologies are built, they preference one group and marginalize others. People complain about it, and then they retrofit the original technology, but it's always kind of an eroded version. It's always still second best. So it still has an effect, though there have been some workarounds put in place.
Yeah, it's bittersweet in a way to see that there's been unintended consequences of past technological revolutions, even in the built environment, right through to our digital landscape today.
Absolutely.
So as somebody studying the unintended consequences of technology and the ethics and social dynamics of all this, how have we examined, like, what's been the methods and approaches taken to examine and understand these situations historically?
Yeah, so there's actually a really big field of critical technology studies that operates through multiple disciplines. So you have social scientists, sociologists, science and technology studies scholars doing sort of ethnographies of how technologies are made and how people use them. You have computer scientists and other forms of technologists who investigate the technical methods by which technologies take shape and to what effect. And you have journalists and activists who uncover the hidden ways that technologies shape social life and social behavior in ways that are often inequitable. So you actually, what we've ended up with is through a variety of methods, qualitative, quantitative, activist, journalistic methods, we've ended up with a really clear repository, a really strong repository of documentation about the ways that technologies are political, power laden, and reinforce a particular status quo. What's missing from those, or what a trouble with those, is that because they operate through different disciplines, they often end up talking past each other instead of to each other. So we have a great documentation of a whole lot of individual cases and ways that technology affect our social lives. But what we don't have is a clear thread that brings them all together so that we can understand that picture holistically and think collectively, interdisciplinarily, how to move forward, how to not only hold existing systems to account, but also how to do better. How do we make better things?
It's just dawned on me as well that when we look at the digital community that I'm familiar with, at least, there does seem to be a culture at the high-performing end of wanting to do the right thing. And so web accessibility standards is an interesting one, where to be considered a good designer, a good web developer, you kind of have to be able to demonstrate how your work is adhering to accessibility standards. And I can imagine a future where, I hope, maybe this is wishful thinking, where this consideration given to the unintended consequences of your work is part and parcel of being a good digital technologist, designer, whomever you might be. But it strikes me that the previous methods are very retrospective. They're looking back at what has happened as opposed to being something that can be applied proactively in a planning sort of sense. How do we do our work in a way that's considerate to these unintended consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. And I think the past is really critical, right? Because you have to understand and unearth and unmask and name the problem so that you can move forward. And I think it's a challenge to unmask those problems and to reveal those problems. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of effort. But exactly like you said, we can't just stop at outrage. We also then have to have a productive move, right? So if our algorithmic systems are keeping women out of work and putting Black men in jail, then we need to think about either dismantling those systems, reworking those systems. We have to build something better, right? If the technologies of our time are not serving us or are not serving everybody, or are perpetuating a system that we think is inequitable and unjust and not right, then there does have to be that next productive element. How do we build better things?
Yeah. So it just so happens that you've written a book that seems to help progress that conversation. So the book that we'll keep repeating through the conversation being How Artifacts Are Flawed, where you've reintroduced the concept of affordance thinking. I think you've been very upfront in saying affordance thinking isn't something that you've uniquely come up with, but you have offered very generously a consolidation of affordance thinking, using my own words, not yours now, because you may put it differently. So tell us about the book and your refreshed take on affordance thinking.
Yeah, so the concept of affordances is actually a really old concept. In a super brief history, it started in ecological psychology in the 1960s and 70s with a guy, J.J. Gibson, who was interested in how World War II pilots interacted with their airplanes. So he's interested in human technology interaction from a psychological perspective. In the 80s and 90s, it moved to design studies with a guy named Don Norman, who was interested in how designers could, and in particular should, design objects that communicated to users how those technologies should be used. In recent years, it's become sort of really widespread as a way of analyzing information communication technologies and other hardware and software products as we sort of moved into a digital age. And I guess I should say sort of the line about what affordances are for those who don't know. So affordances are how the features of the technology enable and constrain human behavior, or how the features of a technology function. Mm-hmm. And those can be direct functions like what you actually can do or not do with the technology, what's enabled or prohibited. And it can also be refer to the social implications. So what the technology does with us, right? So a really sort of simple example of this is if we think about Instagram. Instagram has a very simple one-click share feature where you can share images that you've taken with your mobile device. And it's interoperable with the hardware and software of that phone, right? And so it's really easy now to share your images, and that's an affordance. That's a feature that affords sharing. It makes it really easy. But also then that has social implications. It becomes normative and expected that we share. And because of that, people may start to rethink social situations as documentable and shareable events. And that redefines how we think about our social relationships and social engagements. So that's what affordances are. That's also their history. Again, it's a really widespread term now for people to analyze how the features of technologies matter, right? What do they enable and constrain, and to what effect? This has been a really useful concept because it strikes a nice balance between materiality on the one hand. We recognize that design matters, but also it avoids technological determinism. Technologies don't make us do things, but it affords certain actions and social behaviors. The trouble with affordances, as it's been used and as it's continued to be used, is that it's often treated as binary and universal. And so by binary, what I mean is people talk about the features of a technology either affording or not affording. Either something is inevitable or impossible. Either you can share photos or you cannot. We know in practice, anyone who's engaged with any technology, that actually technologies kind of nudge us with more and less force. It's a more nuanced process than an all or nothing, as would be depicted in a binary formulation. And the other issue is that people treat the features of a technology as universal, or in other words, as though we all have the exact same experience with a technology in all places at all times. Again, we know that not to be true. The thing that often comes to mind for me is elder millennials trying to navigate TikTok, right? So if you're 30 something and you encounter TikTok, it's very confusing for a minute, right? And which is really different than a 20-year-old encountering that same technology. And so what I tried to do in the book is get outside of that, those problems of binary and universality by creating taking the concept and turning it into an operational tool. And an operational tool that lets us, as I think we're about to talk about in a second, ask, instead of asking what technologies afford, ask how technologies afford, for whom and under what circumstances.
Yeah. It's a tremendous piece of work, at least from my practitioner's perspective. I can't obviously speak to the academics, and I'm really excited to get into the details of the mechanisms of affordance that you've detailed. I can't help but bring up a personal experience that's just dawned on me that I've had around affordances, which is some newspaper groups in Australia I've noticed allow you to subscribe online for their newspaper, but then you have to call a call center to unsubscribe. And so, as you've mentioned, so if you looked at that situation from a binary view of affordance, well, there is the option to be able to subscribe and unsubscribe, but then as we move into more of a blurrier, fuzzy view of what affordances have been there, we know as those working in technology that picking up the phone is a much higher friction activity than clicking a button on a web page. So you're going to have a lot more people presumably signing up, and then you'll have a very slow unsubscribe process, which seems really unethical when I look at it. To see this doesn't seem to be an accident. This seems to be a very conscious billing setup that these newspapers have taken up. So we could scrutinize them.
Yeah, absolutely, right? That's a feature.
Yeah.
No, but I mean that's exactly it, right? So it's a feature of the design that's an intentional friction that they input. And I think we've seen a lot of debate in recent years about opt-in versus opt-out for different listservs and ways of receiving information or having your data collected, and those operate really differently. Whether it's opt-in or opt-out, for instance, that your data is available on a website that you visit, right? So can they extract your data? If it's opt-out, then presumptively they have your data. If it's opt-in, you're given a lot more control back, and those work really differently in a way that can't really be depicted as binary.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into the details. As you move from that binary model of affordances to the how do artifacts afford that's implied in your title, talk us through the mechanisms of affordance that you've described.
Yeah. So the way that if the thing I'm trying to do in the book is turn this concept into an operational model, and so doing that, I created a conceptual model that has two parts, the mechanisms of affordance and the conditions of affordance. So the model is called the mechanisms and conditions framework, appropriately. So the mechanisms of affordance are the how do artifacts afford? And I was really intentional in giving that how a simplistic language that would translate across professional disciplines, but also for just sort of everyday lay practitioners who might find use in the framework. So the mechanisms, this how of affordances, are depicted through request, demand, encourage, discourage, refuse, and allow. And that essentially is how the technology pushes and pulls us, the extent to which it constrains us, and how it responds to the bids that we place upon it. And it's situated within a set of conditions so that it'll vary, for instance, by perception, dexterity, and cultural and institutional legitimacy. And without getting into too much of that nitty-gritty detail, essentially, how artifacts afford will vary depending on people's perception. What do you know? Like, what do you know about the functions of a technology? Do you know what it can do or not? How well do you know what it can do? Dexterity, how much skill do you have to operate that piece of technology? But then also cultural and institutional legitimacy. How socially supported are you in using that piece of technology or that system?
Right. I don't think I've spent enough time studying those last few dot points you've made. But the request, demand, encourage, discourage, refuse, allow, I spent a lot of time. So selfishly, could you recap those? So recap the conditions.
Yeah. So the conditions are the second part of the model. So if we think about the mechanisms of affordance, or how we get outside of the binary problem in affordances, the conditions of affordance are how we get outside of the universal. So not everybody is going to have the same experience with the technology. And the dimensions that are really going to define your experience with that technology are your perception of it. What functions do you know are or are not available? For instance, do you know that you can unsend an email in Google? Do you know that you can opt out of data extraction on a particular website? A second dimension is dexterity, how much skill you have with the system, right? So maybe you know that there's some way to share photographs from your phone, but you've never done it before and you don't really know what buttons to push or what happens when you push them. So there's going to be variability there in your skill. And then cultural and institutional legitimacy. How socially supported are you in engaging the technology? An example that I really like is driving a car, right? So you may know that what a car does and how it operates, and you may actually be really skilled at driving. But if you don't have a driver's license, you're not institutionally supported in operating that vehicle. And because of that, its functions are refused to you.
So the mechanisms of affordance are perhaps what a designer or researcher would use to examine a product and how the product presents to the world in a full stop. And then the conditions are then overlaying the demographic or sociocultural aspects. Like, how do we then overlay the individual into that product environment and see where it intersects?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really important things about that is it would push somebody who is designing a system to name the diversity of users who will encounter that system. And it disallows them to rely on assumptions about some kind of default user, right? But instead to take into account the full diversity of the human condition.
Yeah, great. I really look forward to seeing this in practice. So it's 2020. To what extent do you still think the unintended consequences of technology as a byproduct of move fast and break things and just a natural sort of outcome of the innovation process, to what extent do you still think that's an excusable position for those at the helm of technology companies, be they startups or big tech? Yeah,
it's not. I mean, I don't think that move fast and break things is acceptable anymore, and I don't think it's been for a while. I don't think it was a great idea to begin with, but when the industry was new and there was a lot of money floating around and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of excitement, I think pure innovation was defensible. Pure innovation is no longer defensible because it's become very clear how the innovations that are coming out can have real detrimental consequences on individuals, groups, and society at large. And I also think it's no longer acceptable because technology companies have enormous amounts of power and resources now, right? So they're no longer sort of scrappy 25-year-olds working out of their dad's garage. Like, these are conglomerates that have a strong hold on our information systems, our economic markets, our news cycles, our education systems, our court systems. And so as really powerful and integral institutional actors with a history that lets us know better, I don't think there's any way to let them off the hook. And it's time that legislatively, interpersonally, journalistically, actively, we hold them to account, and they hold themselves to account.
I mean, I think it's easy to start to think that affordance thinking is reserved for just scrutiny of the big tech. It's the FANG problem: Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. But I think it's important to really highlight that we're all responsible for considering the unintended consequences of what we're doing, given the potential for impact into the future. It's not just a problem reserved for FANG, although we do need to address that big problem at that end of the tech market. So where do you think further research could be most impactful? Where do you hope affordance thinking gets applied?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. We've got these really pressing questions right now. We've got sort of these things that are kind of right on the brink. There are issues of new technologies in healthcare, personalized technologies in healthcare in particular. We're seeing a reworking of our urban infrastructures through things like automated vehicles. We're seeing an influx of automation more broadly, in which institutional decision systems are increasingly populated by both human and non-human actors. We're seeing social media infuse our information infrastructures and our social relationships. And I think these ways these elements of our society are in need of not just investigation, but systematic investigation. How do we understand what's going on there in a systematic way, using a language and vocabulary that anybody can understand?
Mm-hmm.
I hope affordances are a way to do that. And another thing that we've talked about that maybe I didn't give enough emphasis to in the book is that I think the affordance framework is really useful as an empowering tool of design.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about anybody from sort of, the big Googles and Facebooks and legacy companies to the scrappy startup trying to get their new business model off the ground, an affordance framework can help them and push them to, but also empower them to think through what they want that product to look like at a social level. How do they want that product to request, demand, encourage, discourage, refuse, and allow, for whom and under what circumstances? And then to work backwards and build features or technical specifications that will bring about those outputs that they've identified. So I think in that sense, it's not just a tool of interrogation, but also a productive tool of making and building.
Yeah, I think we did talk about that, and I think it's to loop back to my comment at the beginning. We're already seeing developers and designers really look at accessibility standards, and they've got the W3C accessibility standards to sort of latch their teeth into and refer back to. So I see huge potential in affordance thinking and the framework that you've laid out in the book to become that the ammo that the design practitioner can use in the workplace to say, we need to consider this, and here's the common language, to your point earlier as well, that we can use to have a conversation about what our product does potentially do once it's released into the wild and grows. So yeah, super exciting work. Well done.
Thanks so much.
So have you got a copy of the book there to show off?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I held it up for a second earlier, but now you can get a fuller look.
Yeah.
And just, I guess, a brief teaser. There's a grocery cart on here, a shopping trolley. If you buy the book, the intro is a story about me being confused about a shopping trolley. So that's for your pleasure.
That was a uniquely Australian experience as you arrived into Canberra. Yeah. It's funny how we take some things for granted. The slang, the trolleys, I had to explain the word sausage sizzle to some Americans recently, and they were very confused, but it made sense once we explained it to them.
There's a lot of surprising translations between American and Australian English.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Jenny. It's been a real pleasure to follow your work and be a part of it in some small way, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how your book's taken up, and would encourage designers, developers. I was even thinking regulators. This would be, we lack common language and regulations. I'll hold us back from going down that rabbit hole. It'd be great to see people take up the book and start to put it into practice in their worlds.
Well, thank you so much. It was fun the second time around too.
Cool. Thanks, Jenny.